You can probably sum up the strained geopolitical relationship between the US and China in a single word: Taiwan. That small island off the coast of mainland China has been a thorn in their side ever since the retreat of the Republic of China from the island in 1949. Even today, China refuses to acknowledge that Taiwan exists as a separate entity, fervently claiming that it's part of China instead. The rest of the world is taking sides in this conflict, albeit on the down low. The rest of the world, that is, apart from the US and its allies. While the US doesn't formally recognize Taiwan, nor conduct direct diplomatic relations with the island, you wouldn't be able to tell based on how much support the US government has provided to them for decades. But the latest round of support is all but direct acknowledgement that the US might be finally ready to formalize relations with Taiwan, regardless of China's protests on the matter. The US has pledged $571 million in direct military support to Taiwan in the form of donations or sales of military equipment, vehicles, and ammunition. All of these would eventually become available for Taiwan to use as part of its military forces, which would ideally allow it to negate some of China's aggressive posturing in recent months. But what exactly is in the allotment for the military aid? How does it threaten the current US-China relations, and could it have far-reaching consequences? In this video, we'll go over each of those points and explain how it could be a devastating blow to China. First, let's delve a bit more into the specifics of what this round of military aid entails. Understandably, both the US and Taiwan governments are tight-lipped when it comes to divulging the actual specifics of what kind and amount of equipment Taiwan is going to get this time. According to a statement directly from the White House, this round of military aid will include up to $571.3 million in defense articles and services of the Department of Defense and military education and training to provide assistance to Taiwan. One of the few actual details that were divulged is the payment distribution, where roughly $265 million would go toward purchasing and outfitting 300 tactical radio systems, and another $30 million would go to 16 gun mounts. However, there are no specifics on the type and model of either equipment, so there's hardly any point in speculating about its contents before any more news eventually surfaces. Unfortunately, that might take a while, as military procurement of this scale can sometimes take years. Even if Taiwan pays immediately, receiving newly made equipment could mean a delay of years before the country actually receives the equipment. What is known is that it isn't even the first package of military aid that the US sent in 2024. In September, the Biden administration approved another $567 million in military aid and sales to Taiwan. Again, there were really no major details on the type of aid being delivered, just that the aid would directly benefit Taiwan's military and national defense capabilities. For instance, at the time, Taipei was concerned about a lack of functional combat aircraft. However, it's not certain whether this request was fulfilled during the shipment or if it would become part of a later one. The previous package of military aid accentuated how the US Armed Forces frequently leverage the concept of asymmetrical warfare and wants to bring Taiwan in line with that doctrine. More specifically, the US is known to have some of the most advanced weapons and defense systems in the world, as well as access to practically limitless surveillance and drone capabilities through its NATO allies and other countries like Japan and Australia. Many of these are highly developed militaries in their own right, with their own contemporary designs that rival US technology or that they purchase directly from American suppliers. On the other side are countries like China, Russia, and to a lesser extent Iran and North Korea. Most of them have developed weapons that could be considered comparable to their Western counterparts in some respect. However, the US remains years, if not decades, ahead in terms of technology and deadliness. To compensate, these countries often use the mantra, "quantity is quality." They use more robust industrial capacities to build up their armies and create reliable but relatively cheap military equipment that can be mass-manufactured at the fraction of the time of their Western counterparts. The concept of asymmetrical warfare is also applied to the strategy that the US and China are using to create military pressure in the South China Sea. In this case, China is arguably the aggressor, putting its navy on full display during its numerous combat exercises, some of which have gone perilously close to Taiwan. Meanwhile, the US operates a swathe of military bases scattered across islands and archipelagos that surround the South China Sea to create a dispersed wall of resistance, so to speak. By leveraging its potent surveillance capabilities, long-range options, and an overwhelming advantage in terms of air power, the US has been able to keep track of Chinese movements and maintain a tenable status quo in which China doesn't make any overtly aggressive notions toward Taiwan. But why is Taiwan so important to the US? Well, the answer is a bit complicated, like many other topics surrounding Indo-Pacific geopolitics. Taiwan is not relatively close to the US, both geographically or ideologically. However, the island's ties with the rest of the Indo-Pacific, China included, place it in a precarious position that has deep-seated ramifications for the US. The island's position within the South China Sea is what matters here. Since it's halfway between Japan and the Philippines, and its nearest neighbor, at least via sea, is none other than China itself, Taiwan essentially cuts off China's access to the Greater Pacific. At the moment, China doesn't really have the ability to project military power beyond its claim in the South China and East China Seas, which heavily limits what options it has in terms of naval and littoral, i.e. coastal, warfare. Consider the scenario where China manages to annex Taiwan. In that case, it can develop and deploy submarines and build military bases that overlook the Pacific, heavily limiting the scope of US military operations, not only within the region, but possibly worldwide. Right now, the US uses an array of refueling bases in the Pacific to deploy its air force from the mainland into the Middle East. While the route is geographically longer in this manner, the US gains an advantage by being able to deploy its forces with practically no oversight from other powers, as most of the flight takes place over open ocean and is not regulated or monitored. The other aspect of American operations in Taiwan relates to the perceived notion of alliances throughout the Indo-Pacific. Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and the Philippines all have alliance agreements with the US and are all extremely close to China, either by land or sea. With the US backing Taiwan, all those other countries have a vested interest in doing the same. The reasoning is fairly simple. If the US abandons Taiwan, it wouldn't merely allow China to have a further reach into the Pacific. All those 5 countries would now need to reconsider their alliances. In a theoretical scenario where China controls Taiwan, it would have a leading position in the South China Sea. While the 5 US allies are technically also allied to one another, they are not particularly geographically close and are split by China's sea claims. They would have few options. The first one is to trust the US to come to their defense, a notion that would be diminished if the latter already set a precedent by abandoning Taiwan. Secondly, they might ally themselves with China, or at least placate it and agree to some of its demands, which would likely have a negative effect on their economies and geopolitical independence. Third, the Indo-Pacific geopolitics and military power projection become a free-for-all, with each country mounting its military and possibly even developing nuclear weapons, since China already has them. Either way, the result is a destabilized Indo-Pacific, where the US no longer has much influence and might even lose some beneficial trade and economic opportunities. Another major reason why the US and perhaps the rest of the world might have a vested interest in keeping Taiwan independent from China is economics. The small island is responsible for creating a vast majority of semiconductors and computer chips, which are necessary for practically any industry due to the global reliance on technology. Bloomberg has attempted to map out the ramifications on the global GDP in scenarios where China blockades Taiwan with or without drawing the US into a conflict. If China mounts a blockade on Taiwan, its exports would practically grind to a halt, causing a potential global economic crisis, one that easily outstrips the grain crisis during the initial months of the war in Ukraine or the supply chain issues during the COVID pandemic. According to Bloomberg's analysis, Taiwan would lose around 12% of its GDP due to the complete stopping of trade. The lack of semiconductors on the global market would lead to a roughly 5% decline in the global average GDP, while the US would lose roughly 3.3% of its GDP. The second scenario, in which the Chinese blockade is successfully answered by the US declaring war and bringing in its allies in the Indo-Pacific, has even worse projections. In that case, US-China trade, as well as the trade between various Indo-Pacific countries, would similarly be affected by the conflict. Taiwan's economy would drop by an astounding 40%. The global average GDP might go down by more than 10% as countries impose economic sanctions and tariffs on one another. However, the countries in Southeast Asia would be disproportionately affected as they enter a wartime economy and have to contend with China withdrawing its own trade. The two scenarios might seem a bit paradoxical when you take an overview of only the economic numbers. Based on these figures, the world would technically lose less in terms of economic growth if China blocked Taiwan unimpeded. However, you have to keep in mind the geopolitical ramifications of this move. If the US doesn't defend Taiwan, the action would essentially be a repeat of the invasion of Ukraine, only this time, NATO wouldn't come to the rescue. The result is an authoritarian takeover of a democratic country, a move that could plunge the world into another Cold War or even the Third World War. To that end, the US maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan and reinforcing its national security goes beyond the former's image of world police. It shows the basics of international relations when it comes to protecting a country's sovereignty and maintaining its borders. Additionally, whether or not the US decides to intervene, the economic ramifications are still a net negative for the entire world. And if China does manage to annex Taiwan, it will be able to control where and how it exports its products. Considering that China would use the move to project more military and geopolitical power into the region, it's highly unlikely that an annexation of Taiwan would then lead China to increasing its trade with the US. It's more likely that the US loses out on vital semiconductor and chip trade, which would then cripple its domestic industries and research opportunities. Essentially, what would start with a loss of economy could spiral into China quickly catching up to the US's technological levels, especially in terms of military capabilities. So with that in mind, what is the US doing to protect Taiwan exactly? Well, the details that come with each round of military aid and sales to Taiwan are never disclosed to the public, leading to plenty of speculation but very little substance. Both military aid packages in 2024, in September and December, only mention that the US still maintained its stance on providing mutually beneficial national defense-related services and military training. Out of the available details for 2024 is that Taiwan actually received new US-made Abrams M1A2 tanks, which are among the most technologically advanced and reinforced military vehicles to date. However, this is part of an order that was placed back in 2019, showcasing the pace at which military aid and sales are actually accomplished. The reports on the tanks finally arriving in Taiwan to replace the obsoleting models from the Cold War also mention that the US still has 70 more tanks to deliver as part of the same order. The rest of the tanks are expected to arrive between 2025 and 26. In a similar vein, most sales that the US has announced for Taiwan are either in progress or have been completed a long time ago and have only recently been fulfilled by the US defense contractors. Due to Taiwan being a relatively small island nation, its national defense systems favor long-range deterrent strategies, such as anti-air defense systems and missile platforms, rather than traditional land vehicles. Still, the country has acquired a solid amount of both, and all from sales that were conducted from 2000 onward, showing at least 2 decades of continued investments. For an example of deterrent strategies, take the Patriot anti-air defense batteries, which have performed incredibly in the ongoing war in Ukraine, and were a part of the reason why Russia, with its considerably larger air force, has failed to maintain air supremacy over Ukraine. Taiwan has purchased 7 batteries from the US, with the first batteries arriving on the island in 1997 and 2001. In 2009, 3 newer PAC-3 systems arrived on the island, which are supposedly capable of detecting and countering the faster ballistic missiles. Each modern Patriot system costs around $1.1 billion, so it would take 2 of the more recent military packages to cover a single system. In 2010, the countries renewed the agreement, upgrading the previous PAC-2 models to PAC-3. Then in 2022, the nations renewed a contract which now included an order for 100 PAC-3 missiles worth $833 million. The missiles should start being delivered sometime in 2025, with the order expected to be completed by 2026. The other long-range system is the HIMARS, which has also been showcased in the war in Ukraine. The HIMARS is an offensive system, focusing on launching missiles that have lower range but higher mobility and penetrative capacities. They can theoretically be used to deploy surface-to-sea missiles to target opposing ships, which could limit the impact of a Chinese blockade and compensate for Taiwan's lack of air forces. The first administration of President Donald Trump was the one responsible for selling the HIMARS system to Taiwan, with an order of 11 systems and 64 missiles worth $436 million in 2020. Like before, the systems are only expected to arrive sometime between 2025 and 26, likely in waves. While HIMARS has been used offensively in Ukraine, preventing Russia from being able to make progress in its ground offensive, its use for Taiwan would be purely defensive. This comes from the missile's lower range compared to common ballistic missiles. In a theoretical scenario where China attacks Taiwan, the HIMARS would be used to potentially sink ships or make a counter-offensive if China launches a littoral attack. In the same vein, Taiwan has also acquired a few types of anti-ship missiles and torpedoes, such as the AGM-84 Harpoon and the Mark 48 torpedoes. In September 2022, the Biden administration approved a $1.1 billion arms package for Taiwan, which included 60 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and 100 Sidewinder tactical air missiles. Subsequently, in April 2023, the Pentagon announced a $1.17 billion contract for 400 Harpoon missiles, with production expected to be completed by March 2029. As for the Mark 48 torpedoes, Taiwan has acquired a total of 108 of them, with the newest batch of 18 ordered in 2020. They use the more advanced ADCAP variant of the torpedo, which can receive updates to its inertial systems and electronics. This would theoretically allow the US to keep maintaining and improving upon the torpedoes as technological warfare evolves. But there's one element that all of these orders have in common. They're all long-term plans and only partially complete. Currently, Taiwan's army is still heavily dependent on US support to provide the first line of defense against China. Without it, the Chinese army could very easily overtake the island. However, with the US maintaining an alliance with Taiwan, it's unlikely that China will make a move. There have been contrasting opinions on if and when China would try to attack Taiwan. Some analysts have suggested that a blockade could come as early as in the next few years. This would allow China to capitalize on the fact that many of the weapons that Taiwan has purchased have not been constructed yet, and NATO is otherwise occupied with providing donations to Ukraine. Of course, this doesn't take into account the current military advantage that the US has over Chinese forces. Most of the recently revealed Chinese equipment, vehicles, and even ships can't even come close to their American counterparts. In pretty much every report, the Chinese military is experiencing some issues with testing their equipment. Their supposedly 5th-plus generation fighter needed at least 5 engine overhauls, and its stealth capabilities were pilfered from a 3rd-generation stealth fighter from the US with minimal improvements. Their aircraft carrier, while decent, has relatively little in terms of actual firepower or strategic capability. Another option would be for China to attack near the end of the decade, but this presents even more issues. The Taiwanese weapon shipments will likely be completed by then, and the US has already unveiled the next-generation stealth bombers, which should completely blow their predecessors out of the water. Low-rate production on the B-21 Raiders began in 2024, and by 2029, the US Air Force should already have a steady supply. Based on preliminary reports, the B-21 is so promising that the US Air Force has ordered at least 100 for now, and will likely field 200 planes over the next decades. This is in contrast with the B-2s, of which there are only 19 in service due to their prohibitive costs. Additionally, the US Marine Corps has already started to be completely overhauled. By divesting most of their tanks and heavier vehicles, the Marines are expected to turn into guerrilla-like littoral combat units. With the US having several military bases on the islands in the Pacific, the Marine Corps can use drones and long-range missiles to perform area denial and surveillance. The Marine Corps Force redesign is expected to be completed by 2030, meaning that it will only become harder for China to make an offensive move. This puts the most realistic theory of a Chinese attack somewhere after 2030. Some believe that a plan will coalesce before 2049, as that's the expected end date for the Chinese Dream, the current president's objective for China to become the world's biggest power. Obviously, annexing Taiwan plays into that plan, as it would signal that China has more influence and military power in the area than the US. However, by then there's no telling what can happen. While the war in Ukraine is perhaps the most reliable indicator of how technologically advanced nations can wage war against one another, NATO hasn't really given its all when it comes to providing military donations. Most weapons seen in Ukraine are relatively old designs, retrofitted with small improvements or novel small-scale drones that aren't quite suitable for cross-ocean warfare like the theoretical US-China conflict would be. And while the ongoing conflict has been pivotal as a testbed for modern military equipment, it's highly likely that the US and its allies are still keeping the really advanced equipment hidden in development. Because of that, China might never get the opportunity to overtake them technologically. But what do you think? Will China decide it has had enough of posturing and actually blockade Taiwan soon? How would the US respond? Thanks for watching, and leave your comments below. Now go and check out "The US just gave Russia another devastating blow," or click this other video instead.